As I've said many times before on this channel, I really love the Total War franchise, and my own personal experience goes back with it all the way back to the original medieval Total War, #1. And so I feel like I've got a pretty good sense of what has changed through the years. Now, a lot has gotten better, and a few things have, let's say, subjectively gotten worse. And I think one of the main criticisms of the Total War franchise, which I consider a legitimate criticism, is through the years they have had a tendency to dumb down some of the mechanics. One of those mechanics in particular is the population mechanic. It makes sense in many ways, some of the sort of streamlining and efficiency that they've added to the game, and so I don't mean to suggest that the old games are way better in every respect than the new ones. But having said that, I think some of us do sometimes still miss some of the, let's say, micromanaging of things that we were able to do in the earlier titles of the Total War franchise. Well, another thing that I want to mention is that Rome 2 Total War, which despite its launch having all sorts of problems, did eventually become a pretty good game overall, and one of the really popular, I think one of the most popular mods of any Total War game through the years is the DEI, the Divide et Impera mod for Rome 2. Now, one thing that mod introduces is a more sophisticated population mechanic. Now, there's a lot of things with that mod that are different with than the vanilla game. But anyway, the population mechanic itself adds back into the game a much higher level of complication and complexity than what you have in vanilla. And I think a lot of players really appreciate that, as reflected by the popularity of that mod. Now, the reason why I mention all of that is because now we want to talk about a mod for Warhammer 3 Total War, and that is, of course, the Crisis of Mortals mod. Now, any number of you have actually mentioned that you wanted me to do a review or a showcase of this mod. It is something I have tried out here and there a couple of times. One thing that I will go ahead and say up front is this is made by Zorbaz, who does a wonderful job of updating his mods. We've talked about some of his mods before on this channel. Anyway, so you can have faith when you try this mod that it is going to be, that the mod author will be responsive to things that pop up, and he does maintain his mods. So I was kind of waiting to see if anything was going to change with this mod. I've been doing a little bit of tinkering with it here and there, and I think this is now at a good state to go ahead and talk about what this mod does, which is a lot, and really how wonderful it is. It's a really great mod in a lot of ways. Now, I will put a little asterisk here in my recommendation. I will go ahead and say up front, I think for people who like an additional level of complexity, and in this particular case, it's adding back in some of the functions that you see in DEI, and he does it in a really clever way, which I'll go into in a minute. But in any case, for people who like a little bit of extra complexity in the game, I really think it adds a lot of value. Having said that, I am going to go in with the caveat of I do think that there are a couple of factions that you don't want to, or I should say, you probably don't want to use this mod with, or at the very least, you should know going into it what it does to those particular factions, so you can decide for yourself whether or not you want the extra, let's call it, nerfing of your faction. Having said all that, let's go ahead and start talking about some of the details of it. Okay, so taking a look here at the mod page itself, as you can see, lots and lots of comments on it. I'll just go ahead and very quickly jump down and show you how the author is very responsive to things that pop up. It has been updated as of the time of this recording. It's been updated very, very recently here. So what exactly does this mod do? Well, I would highly encourage you to read through the mod in detail yourself, because there's a lot of information in here, and it's all really good information that you should know before trying it out. However, at a really high level, you can see based on these categories here, you've got how it affects food, it affects populations, rebellion, replenishment, mercenaries, army mechanics. This is a really interesting one. AI limitations, this is something that we'll get into in a second. Then there's some differences between the different races and how they handle all of these things. And then finally, you can see that he's got listed some of the compatibilities and incompatibilities. So really quickly now, I'm not going to spend very much time on these because we want to actually show you what this does in the game with some real examples. But very quickly, food is something that you're now going to have to keep track of. A little bit different than the sort of generic population growth mechanic that's in vanilla. Now you're going to have buildings that either generate food or decrease the amount of food, meaning that they will consume food. Your population, it's no longer just a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. And when it goes up to the to level 2, you can level up one of your settlements to the third tier, things like that. It goes way beyond that. So you've now got populations divided into different classes, such as nobility, warriors, civilians, and untamed. There's a little bit of variation there depending on what race you're talking about. We'll get into exactly what that does in just a minute, but basically the different units that you recruit and that you replenish all have to have certain types of these different classes of population in order for that to function. Rebellion, there's a little bit of additional complexity that gets added in on top of the regular public order that we have in the game. Replenishment, as I just mentioned, these different classes also not only play into recruitment, but they play in, and also they play into public order as well. They also play into replenishment. Again, we'll talk about examples of that. Mercenaries. So this is basically a rework of the vampire count mechanic that allows you to raise the dead, and we'll see that in the game as well, but it's very interesting. But basically you're going to be allowed to have instant mercenaries at your fingertips using this mod. However, exactly what you're going to get is very much dependent on your population. So we'll get into that as well. Army mechanics. So this is a very interesting one, and I really like this. Of all the things I like in this mod, and there's really a lot to like, I think this might be my favorite because one thing that the Total War games aren't really great at is representing logistics. DEI in Rome 2 does a really good job of this. You have to actually take into consideration the supply lines for your armies as they go invading into foreign territory, for example. Well, this mod handles that as well, and we'll take a look at exactly how that works in game as well. And then finally, really important to keep in mind, AI limitations. So the AI, obviously, whenever you introduce a whole suite of new mechanics like this, the AI doesn't exactly know how to handle it. It's not really built to play into those new mechanics. So you can see here he's basically saying it's playing on the normal difficulty settings for population and rations, and generally plays by all these new mechanics with a notable exception. AI units do not replenish using troops only from the local province, but all provinces in their empire. It is still possible to deplete their troop reserves and stop their units from replenishing. So yeah, just a way to basically make sure that the AI doesn't get completely crippled, because in most cases, most of these mechanics are really going to be, I would say, constraining factors which make it harder for the player as opposed to benefiting the player. Again, that appeals to me, may not appeal to everybody. Your mileage may vary. All right, so for testing this out, I decided first of all to try it out with what we'll call a normal race. So I chose the High Elves, and I decided to go with Imric. And I realized that not everybody plays on Legendary, so I decided to knock down the difficulty by 1 just for purposes of this demonstration. So we're playing this on very hard difficulty. And what you'll see right away is a brand new button on the Army panel called Raise Local Mercenaries. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It allows you to come in and do some instant recruiting for your army. And notice that the price of the mercenaries, I think this is appropriate, is twice as much as it would be to recruit them normally. Now, the next thing that you'll see is something that's kept track of for every army, which is your army's supplies. And you can see not only what their current supplies are, but also what the change is from one turn to the next. And this will become very important as will be demonstrated a little bit later. But basically, as you start to diminish your supplies, you will see your army has a reduced fighting capacity. And you will notice that this army of Mercs has started out in enemy territory. This is one reason why I chose Emmerich for this particular example, is because we wanted to start out in enemy territory, because that makes a huge difference here. Before we try hiring some mercenaries, let's also go ahead and take a look here at our own settlement. So right away, you can see with our settlement, on the right-hand side, there are some numbers associated with the region, and on the left-hand side, there are numbers associated with the entire province. And basically what this shows you is the breakdown of the different types of population for the different classes for this particular race. Now looking over here on the left-hand side, you have hammers, and what hammers determine are your tax rate, and also you'll notice that there is a modifier to the construction time of your buildings, and that's really important because right away, starting out the game, you'll notice that you have an addition to your construction time, so things are going to start out slower than they would be in vanilla, and that's even in your starting territory. It's going to be even worse when you start to take over new territory. Then you also have a calculation of dissidence, which affects your public order overall. And the formula is basically that you need to make sure that you have enough of the good types of people in your province to, let's say, outweigh the bad types of people in your province, or else you will suffer additional problems with respect to your public order. And then finally, you have a food mechanic, which you can see right away. You start out with having plenty of food in your starting province to cover its requirements, but that will change over time because we'll start to take a look at the different buildings, and we'll see the buildings can really impact your food situation. And then one last thing to take a look at is your decisions here. So you've got all your different types of races here, and you've got different decisions on what type of a policy you want to follow with respect to how to handle those populations. So you can choose from no preference to exterminate, to restriction, to banishment. And those pretty much mean what they sound like, and what they will affect is a migration mechanic. Just for kicks, I decided to go ahead and banish some Skaven, for example, put restrictions on ogres and greenskins, and of course you want to exterminate all of the chaos. Alright, and so what do all those populations get used for? Well, let's go ahead and jump back into the army here, and let's go ahead and try out this new raise local mercenaries mechanic. We're going to choose a unit of archers with light armor. We're going to press recruit, and what happened here? Holy cow. Did anybody know that was going to happen? So yeah, what happens here is because we're in a foreign territory that does not have the proper kind of population to support the recruitment of a new unit like we just raised, well, that's why we ended up with a new unit with only 9 soldiers in it. So, yeah, that's what the population is for, or at least that's one of the most important things that the population is for, is you want to make sure that you have the right types of population to support the units that you're recruiting, or in this case, hiring as mercenaries. Now, I don't think there's a way to tell exactly which class each particular unit pulls from, but it is more or less what you would expect in terms of the higher tier units pulling from nobility versus the lower tier units pulling from the lesser classes. And it's important because, of course, what this means is that when we jump into our battle here, this unit is effectively useless for this battle, and we have to basically put them in a position where they won't suffer any casualties at all during the battle, or we might lose it. So really kind of important to keep track of your population because you want to avoid what I just did right here. All right, so coming out of that field battle, let's go ahead and then take the settlement as well. Again, we're still going to have to protect this archer unit, but then let's find out what happens with the population when we take over a new settlement like this. Okay, and so besides all of the usual things that you would do after every battle and after every conquest, you now have the additional complexity of wanting to take a look at how the population is affected in your new settlement. You'll notice again right away the construction time for the new buildings is greatly increased because your province is really not operating at 100% efficiency at this point. And as you would expect in a brand new settlement, there is actually a population of 0 for all of the different classes of your race. So you're going to have to do something about that because you're very much handicapped by not having any of the appropriate population in this brand new settlement. I really like this, by the way, just as an aside. This is what the mod is really all about, is it really forces you to think through and let's say plan your conquests completely differently than how it works in vanilla. It's going to be so much harder to steamroll the way that you do in a regular vanilla Warhammer game. The fact that you don't have any of the proper population in this particular settlement is not only going to drag down the overall efficiency of the province, it's going to make it harder to do recruiting, it's also going to make it a lot harder to do replenishment, which we'll see here in a minute. And then on top of all of that, you've got this new mechanic, devastation, which makes sense. It's caused by the sort of things that you would expect to cause devastation in a particular region, and that then does affect other aspects of managing your settlements, like population growth, hammers, and migration. But the good news is that it does improve on its own over time. And so we can see here how the overall numbers for the province have changed. So the more you keep adding these devastated 0 population settlements to your empire, the more it's going to kind of drag things down, at least initially, and you're going to have to basically allow for time to pass for the proper population to move in and for the devastation to go away. The good news is that we're still producing enough food overall for the whole province that at least that's not going to cause us a problem. Note that we can still recruit new units in at full strength in this particular settlement because I think the way that it works is that the new unit recruitment, as opposed to the mercenary recruitment, happens from the provincial population, and since we're still in the same province as our starting capital, then there's still sufficient population for us to go ahead and recruit these new units without any penalty. And as I mentioned, the normal unit recruitment is half the price of recruiting mercenaries, so you definitely don't want to over-rely on mercenaries, but they're nice to have them there for emergencies, basically. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the different types of buildings and how they are affected by this mod. And what you can see right away is that you've got some buildings that add food and others that consume food. Pretty much what you would kind of expect, I think, at least for the high elves. I'll talk about one exception to that coming up here in a few minutes. But as you can see here, it's just another thing that you're going to have to manage in terms of your settlement development. This is kind of similar, I think, to how it works in Rome 2, if I remember correctly. You do have to worry a little bit about having enough food, or at least in DEI, about having enough food to be able to maintain all of the developing that you're doing in all of your settlements. So right off the bat, you can already see how the addition to your construction time is going to slow down the pacing of the campaign. But another way that you're definitely going to notice the pacing of the campaign slow down is with your replenishment. Notice how we are in friendly territory, and normally we should be getting replenishment at this point, but because we don't have the proper type of population in this region, we're really not replenishing. So there you go. There is an added importance to having the right type of population in your regions. Now, I suppose you could raise the question of whether this is realistic or not, or whether it makes sense that you can recruit new units into an army in a region like this, but you can't actually replenish the existing units. However, I don't really think it's all that unbelievable, because if you think about the new units, you can kind of, I think, assume that those units were actually mustered and trained from a different location and then sent forward to catch up to this army. So even though it's abstracted for purposes of the game, where it makes it appear as though they're popping right into your army, the reality is they probably came from a training site and marched all the way up to catch up to your army. That's just for those of you who think about the things like that. And just by way of comparison here, I wanted to show how it is in vanilla. So I've basically followed exactly the same steps in a vanilla campaign. You can see that in this particular case, the farm building there is actually already built because it only took one turn in vanilla, and you can see right away what a difference we are getting in terms of a replenishment here in turn number 2 compared to how it was in the mod. And here's where I'll go ahead and mention that not everybody will like this feature, because it does slow down the overall pacing of the campaign. It adds an additional level of challenge, which I like, but as I mentioned before, your mileage may vary. All of us have sort of different opinions on what is the ideal pacing of a campaign. And so here we are back into the same Immerc campaign on turn 4, and we can see that over time our hammers now have increased in this province, so we're becoming a little bit more efficient. Our debuffs have been reduced. Our food situation is still looking pretty good, and of course I have at this point finished the conquest of the third and last settlement in this province, so we now have the entire province under our control. And one thing that's really interesting to look at here are these migration numbers. So you can see how some migrants are moving out of one of your settlements and then moving into your other settlements. So I think it would probably require a lot of sort of playing around to see what works the best in terms of the different decisions. Like I said, I just kind of did it based on theme to try something out where I was exterminating some and banishing others. And anyway, you get the idea, but worth messing around with. The formula is not written out in the mod page, and I'm glad. I think it's just something that you kind of have to let happen organically on its own, where migration is happening from one region to another. Now, jumping ahead to turn 6, and I wanted to talk about the effects of army supplies. I mentioned before that I really like this because this is what represents logistics, which is a really underappreciated aspect of military strategy. And so, as you can see here, our army is all of a sudden suffering attrition. So what happened? Well, what happened is you can see the accumulation here of these numbers. We've got too many negatives compared to our positives. And so at this point, we've essentially run out of supplies, and we're suffering from attrition because of basically overextending ourselves. We're in enemy territory, and we don't have a population here that supports us. We don't have, as we move longer and longer, further and further away from our own territory, this is going to happen. Now, one little quirk of the mod, I guess it's not ideal. I think it's probably not that big of a deal, but it's worth mentioning, is that it does show up on the tooltip here as if it were a Skaven plague. It's really not. It's really attrition that you're suffering as a result of not having enough supplies. And you'll notice that even going into encamp stance does not fix the problem. Not only does it not make the attrition go away, but it also doesn't provide replenishment, obviously, which is something that normally you would expect to happen when you go into encampment stance. Okay, and so there's only one thing to do, and that is to turn this province, or this region, I should say, into one of our own. So we're going to go ahead and declare war on the Greenskins here. We're going to take over Darkhold. We're going to occupy it. And we're going to see what effect that has then on our replenishment. And so, as you might expect, We are not really receiving any replenishment at all, but at least we have ended the attrition. And the reason for that is, of course, that we don't have any of the proper population in this brand new region of ours. So not only do you have to conquer something, but you have to allow a little bit of time for the population to start moving in before you can start really getting the benefits of being in friendly territory. I have no idea if it's going to speed things up or not, but I'm going to go ahead and mess around with the decisions here to try to expedite the migration process by banishing the greenskins and encouraging, hopefully, more Asur to move into this region. You can see also our hammers are all the way at 0. We're still looking okay from a food perspective, so that's good, but obviously this settlement here is extremely inefficient until we give it a little bit of time to recover from just having been conquered. Now, we can still do unit recruitment. I remember now when I was messing around with this, I wasn't sure if we would be able to because of the this is a brand new province, and this province doesn't have any of the right population. So apparently it does pull from your, I guess, maybe your global recruitment capabilities as opposed to just from the provincial population. Okay, and so fast forward one more time into turn 8. Meanwhile, we have had the Chaos Dwarves declare war on us, and in preparation for war with them, I've decided to finish recruiting up to a size 20 stack here in this army, and lo and behold, what do we discover? But now we're suffering from attrition, even though we're sitting in our own settlement. Well, why is that? Well, it's because of supplies. We basically have recruited so many units, our army is consuming so many supplies that we have outstripped our capacity to be able to provide those supplies to the army. So you can see right here the mix of the red and the green, the different numbers that add up to basically resulting in we're suffering a mild case of attrition, we'll call it, in this particular army. So once more, it's very important to not overextend yourself in this mod the way that you would in regular vanilla Warhammer. Alright, and so here we are a turn later. That same army is now back to slowly replenishing because our supplies have gotten a little bit back in order here. So actually, I guess this is now turn 8, so apologize for that. That was turn 7 a moment ago. So yeah, there you can see it. So it does kind of recover a little bit on its own. This army that was suffering from attrition just had to basically allow for some accumulation of supplies to happen in order to be able to start replenishing itself again instead of actually losing troops. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the original province that we had. You can see here we are turn 8, and we still have not completely reached maximum efficiency yet in this province, but it's getting closer and closer. So at this point the debuffs are much lower. You can kind of get a sense here of the pacing of how long it's going to take for the population to move around, for the hammers to get up to where you would want them to be. And one thing that I can't really show right here is what the food situation is going to look like in the mid game and the late game. Alright, so kind of a special case of a faction that I wanted to test out because their recruitment mechanics are different than most of your others is Nurgle. Because Nurgle doesn't do normal recruiting from over an in turn, but rather they summon units straight in. So I was a little bit curious how this was going to work in this particular mod. So again, you still have the different population types just like you do for the High Elves, although they have different names obviously, and presumably your different units are still going to pull from the different types of classes of your population. But the one thing that is important to keep track of here is that when you do summoning, even when you're in, like this particular case, a brand new region, you can summon in with the normal expectations for the number of soldiers to be in any particular unit. So I can summon in some Nurglings, right here for example, some Plague Bearers as well, and just for kicks, why not a unit of Toads as well. And so again, you would see basically what you would expect in terms of the number of models in each particular unit. Now, one thing that is a little bit unusual and a little bit unexpected from my standpoint when it comes to Nurgle is the food of the different types of buildings. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure if maybe there is a mislabeling in these tooltips, or if the mod really is designed this way. I expected to see a lot more negatives in terms of the food of these different types of buildings. I'm not really seeing it in any of the infrastructure or defense buildings. And then when we get to the military buildings, it's kind of a hit or miss which ones calls positive food versus negative food, which ones are giving you a -1 food, -2 food, -4 food. Those seem to be the three different numbers that we see over and over again, but they're not in the same sequence here when you look at the cycles of the different types of military buildings. So that I'm not exactly sure. Could be a labeling issue, could be really the way that it's intended to work, and I'm just not understanding right off the top of my head exactly why it's laid out this way. But I thought it was a little bit unusual and not at all what I expected. And so finally, that leads us into the last quirk of the mod and the two factions that I personally would suggest maybe not using this mod for, or at least not without understanding what you're getting yourself into. So I chose Helman Gorst here of the Vampire Counts, and that's because I knew he started off in foreign territory just like Emmerich did, and what you will see happen is his raised dead mechanic has been completely replaced by the higher local mercenaries mechanic. It is, again, what you would expect, because it was the raised dead mechanic that the mod author has used to basically give all the different factions the higher mercenaries mechanic. So anyway, it makes kind of sense from that standpoint. However, I would say that this is a nerf for Vampire Counts and for Vampire Coast. Let's go ahead and show an example here. We are going to summon in a unit of zombies using what used to be the raised dead mechanic, and you can see we only got 16, so we did not get a full stack of zombies. Well, why is that? It, of course, makes sense. It's the same thing that happened to us back with Emmerich as well, which is we're in foreign territory. There is not the right type of population in this province to hire in quote-unquote mercenary zombies. So decide for yourself whether or not that's going to be an issue for you. Obviously, we don't really think of zombies being mercenaries. We think of zombies being raised from the dead. The reason I consider this as a nerf is really twofold. Number one, you're giving other factions a mechanic which would have been considered one of the, let's say, strategic advantages of the Vampire Counts or the Vampire Coast over other factions. You're giving them that advantage of being able to use the raised dead to pull up units instantaneously. So you're not only giving other factions the mechanic that used to be yours alone, but at the same time you're actually nerfing it. So no longer can you recruit in full stacks of units. Instead, you're going to suffer from the same constraints that every other faction does in terms of hiring mercenaries. From a realism standpoint, I wish it wasn't this way. This is maybe my one criticism of the mod, which, again, I want to stress how much I love the mod overall, and I think it does some really clever mechanical implementations here. But yeah, I would kind of say that when you think of raising dead, you should be able to roll up to a battlefield, or for that matter, fight a massive battle and see all of the casualties that go down in that battle, and then use your magical ability to be able to raise the dead. It's really, it's a quality that's unique to these factions that all of a sudden, is no longer nearly as powerful, and it doesn't realistically make sense that you're hiring zombies. You should be raising them from the dead, not hiring them, and thus dependent upon a living population to pull them from. But anyway, it's a little bit of a nitpick, but I did want to make that clear. And so then the final quirk that I wanted to talk about, first of all, is with the Skaven. And so it's nice when you're fighting against your neighbors to be able to click on their settlements like we can do here with Shambletown, and we can see, what the status of that particular region and province is from an ogre's perspective. You can't do that with the Skaven, unfortunately, because they all show up as ruins. Now, obviously, you could send a hero in there to scout the ruins. That then would allow you to identify that it's actually a Skaven settlement, and then you can click on it and see all your same numbers. But until you do that, or unless you do that, then yeah, those numbers are completely missing to you. So you can't really get any good sense of your population that you're dealing with a Skaven settlement, because it's basically just not going to provide that information, while the game thinks that it is a ruins instead of a Skaven settlement. Anyway, overall, yeah, really a lot to like. Again, I kind of feel like those things are a little bit nitpicky. I will say this, from my own perspective, because I like the slower paced campaign and I like the more challenging campaigns, for me, I'm kind of thinking the ideal campaign is a combination of this mod plus the campaign movement reduction mod, which will slow down the movement. So basically you're looking at the ultimate in what would be like a slow slog grind of a war. But again, that may not be for everybody, but certainly something that appeals to me, or at least it will at certain times. So yeah, anyway, let me know if any of you have tried this mod. I know that many of you have, so please let me know what your own experiences are, and let your fellow Warhammer players know what your experiences are as well. Really a lot to like here. Highly recommended, at least for anybody who thinks that they would like to try a change of pace. If people want to see a faster paced Warhammer, this is probably not going to be the mod for them. But for anybody else, I would say highly recommended. In any case, I think I will go ahead and leave it there. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I will see you in the next video.